Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar sponsored by the HIBAR Research Alliance, also known as the HRA. I'm Scott Slovic from the University of Idaho, and I'll be the moderator for today's one-hour event. This is the 13th in our series of webinars for researchers, research administrators, and others who are interested in what we call highly integrative, basic and responsive research. Our previous webinars are now available for viewing on the HRA website, which can be found at hibar-research.org. A recording of today's webinar will also be posted on the HRA website. Before today's featured presentation by Dr. Sarah Rebolloso McCullough, I'd like to offer a brief heads up about our next webinar in this series, which will take place on November 9th. Gaurav Sant and Thomas Traynor from the UCLA Laboratory for the Chemistry of Construction Materials will give a presentation tentatively titled Creating Sustainable Solutions for Carbon Removal, How a HIBAR Project Turned Carbon Dioxide into Concrete, based on work of the UCLA Carbon Built project, which won the X Prize competition in 2021. And now I'd like to explain the structure of today's meeting. We will begin with a brief overview of the HIBAR research concept by Dr. Lauren Whitehead. Sarah will then speak about her project called Asking Different Questions, a new graduate student training program at the University of California at Davis that's aimed at giving early career researchers a more solid foundation for doing cross-sectoral research for between 20 and 25 minutes. And then we'll have approximately 20 minutes for Q&A, followed by an opportunity for Sarah to offer a few final takeaways. Dr. Lauren Whitehead, the director of the HIBAR Research Alliance, is a professor in the Department of Physics and Astronomy at the University of British Columbia. He'll briefly introduce the concept of HIBAR research and the HRA organization.
I'm going to begin now by answering three questions, and each about a minute. The first is, what is HIBAR research? The second question will be, what is the HIBAR Research Alliance? And then, of course, most importantly, how do these ideas connect to today's webinar topic? So I'll begin with the first one. HIBAR research is found in projects that embrace two key dualities. They combine academic leadership and societal leadership. And they also combine academic purpose and societal purpose. So it's those really four ideas together that suggest or indicate that a given research project is HIBAR research. And so the key takeaway from this slide really is the notion that we have highly integrative combination of these four ideas, and that's the highly integrative representing the HI of HIBAR, and a basic and responsive character, basic research and also responding to society. So together that forms the acronym for HIBAR. But the most important thought is that HIBAR research itself lies at the intersection of those four basic and important concepts. And they're all good concepts, but they're especially good together. And that's the key thing about HIBAR research that we attempt to encourage in the HIBAR Research Alliance, which is what I'll now speak about. So the HIBAR Research Alliance is a distributed network of experienced volunteers who are well organized and united in their support of HIBAR research. The HRA aims to increase the prevalence of university HIBAR research from about one project in 20 today to about 1 in 5 by 2030, while improving all types of research at universities. This will help universities respond more effectively to societal needs, while also increasing the excellence of their basic research. The UC Davis Asking Different Questions program offers key insights and tools for carrying out improved HIBAR research. This is why we're so pleased to have this discussion here today and to hear further from Sarah. So the key thing here is that the program encourages researchers to avoid erroneous assumptions within their research questions in order to improve research quality. So that's one key aspect. And this also helps them move from a narrow disciplinary focus to one with a broader and clearer view of societal needs. The net result is a research project with those HIBAR traits that we've discussed, being discovery-oriented while focusing on public impact, and also harmonizing the insights of academic and societal experts. So I'm very pleased to have a chance to hear from Sarah today. And on that note, Scott, I'd like to hand back to you.
Thank you very much, Lauren. That was really helpful. And now I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Sarah Rebolloso McCullough. Sarah is the Associate Director of the Feminist Research Institute at the University of California, Davis, where her work is dedicated to creating more equitable systems of knowledge production. As an expert in research culture, she focuses on promoting equity-based solutions to social problems. One aspect of this is creating meaningful and respectful dialogue across the boundaries that typically divide universities and communities, activists and researchers, scientists and humanists, and workers and policymakers. Today, she'll describe for us the Asking Different Questions research training program, seeking to highlight some of the program's connections to HIBAR research. Sarah has suggested that we might propose certain actions we'd like people to consider taking in response to this webinar. Two such actions that have occurred to the HRA leadership team are: one, that attendees will be sufficiently interested to learn more about the Asking Different Questions program. And HRA manager Michelle Mossman will post relevant links in the chat box for those who wish to follow up. And also, number two, we hope attendees will share information about this program with their colleagues. At this point, I'd like to turn things over to Sarah for her presentation.
Scott, thank you so much. It is a real pleasure to be with you all today. I'll share a little bit more about my background before kind of launching more into the formal presentation. The foundations of my research really look at how not just academic expertise matters, but lived experience and the expertise gained from that matter too. So my academic training and that expertise does emerge from the study of science and technology studies and cultural studies, which really look at how culture and power impact our scientific and technological processes. In terms of my lived experience, I do identify as Chicana, and that gives me a certain experience about how legacies of racism and poverty can impact one's experience in the world. At the same time, I also am read by many people in the world as white, and therefore I do not have expertise around what it's like to move about the world as a person of color, or as someone who's read as a person of color, I should say. So I share that so that you have a little bit of framing about where I'm coming from in this presentation, and also to demonstrate the types of expertise that we really center within the Asking Different Questions program. So I believe, based on my training, that when we take the steps to do more equitable research, to do research that is addressing histories of injustice, we are also simultaneously doing more accurate and impactful research. And so that's one of the main premises within the Asking Different Questions program. The Asking Different Questions program was created with a National Science Foundation Innovation and Graduate Education Grant. It's been going on at UC Davis for about 3 years now. And we are, able to share a lot of resources, hoping that this is useful for other institutions as well. The real premise of the program is that we want to provide scientists who have a commitment to equity and justice, or who want to develop that commitment, the intellectual tools to make good on that. And we draw upon literature, decades of literature really, from the fields of science and technology studies, ethnic studies, indigenous studies, feminist theory, and as well as history and other social science and humanities. And we really bring that to apply it to STEM disciplines. And at the end of the day, what we've discovered we're really teaching is the strengths of doing value-based research. And I see this as really strongly aligning with the mission of HIBAR, specifically because there's a value there of having research that has a real societal impact, while simultaneously furthering basic science goals of knowledge production. And what we've learned are the strengths of this program is that one, the asking different questions training tends to create more equitable research cultures. It changes what questions are asked, who is asking those questions, and why we are asking those questions. It also tends to lead to smarter partnerships. And these smarter partnerships tend to improve the knowledge base to solve large global problems. And finally, we're also seeing that this training improves recruitment and attention, especially of those who have historically been excluded from the academy. Specifically, in part because the program encourages the specific expertise that arises from those lived experiences. So to kind of like flesh out a little bit more how this works and what it looks like is, we see this training as the first step in a transformational model for how we do research that I hope can help contribute to the really wonderful and ambitious goals of HIBAR. By one, when we start with an equity-centric research training, this then enables new collaborative projects. I have there one example of a project that I'm working with on food security for Native Greenlanders that's really working to study the food processes of Indigenous populations in Greenland and change food safety regulations so that those are being able to be brought to more commercial markets. These sorts of collaborative projects provide new research experiences for students that are directly connected to societal need, something that our students really care a lot about. These projects also tend to have deeper community engagement, thus also increasing the relevancy of the university and trust in science within the broader community. And finally, this also, as I said before, can lead to greater retention of faculty and students. So what type of stuff, specifically, what types of things do we talk about within this research training program? We talk about topics such as what have researchers had to give up, quote unquote, to be a part of the scientific community? And that question is drawing on the work of people like Bano Subramanian, who wrote a book called Ghost Stories for Darwin. She was trained as an evolutionary biologist and ended up leaving her field, in part because of what she had to give up to stay there. We also draw on the work of people like Shonda Prescott Weinstein, who wrote a book called The Disordered Cosmos, specifically about the exclusion of Black scholars within the field of physics. We also ask questions such as, how are the legacies of colonialism in science still with us today? And in teaching that, we draw on scholars such as Max Liboron, who wrote Pollution is Colonialism, and Indigenous scholars such as Jessica Hernandez, who wrote the book Fresh Banana Leaves, Healing Indigenous Landscapes Through Indigenous Science. And we also ask questions such as, how is bias present in the language, models, and theories in my field? And there, we draw upon scholars such as Sophia Noble, who wrote Algorithms of Oppression, How Search Engines Reinforce Racism, and scholars such as Harriet Washington, who wrote Medical Apartheid, The Dark History of Medical Experimentation on Black Americans from colonial times to the present. And so we bring in this vast body of research, and we really help our the graduate students and postdocs and faculty that are taking part in the sessions to understand, how can I directly apply this to what I'm doing? And the feedback we've gotten has been, really encouraging. From the beginning, we saw after the first session that people took that 89% of those who attended planned on taking action after attending, and 89% would recommend the sessions to colleagues. And in fact, literally every single person that came said they plan to attend future sessions. Now, we also asked people if they felt underrepresented in their field, because we wanted to understand what our audience, what was the experience of our audience. And we saw that 55% of those in attendance said yes. And that does tend to be pretty consistent throughout the sessions. So that tells us, we're teaching a specific group of scholars who are more drawn to this training than others. And I'll add that so far, this program has been voluntary. We are starting to implement it in a more mandated setting, and we're studying the changes in that setting. You can see here, this is also a program that has really appealed across the disciplines. These are all of the colleges at UC Davis. You see agricultural environmental sciences most represented, followed by social sciences, biological sciences and humanities, physical sciences, engineering, and education. So I want to share some key outcomes that we've begun to see. We've seen significant improvements in students' confidence to do things such as design research that will have a positive social impact, to do research that will lead to new innovations, to do research that will impact policy, to see connections between science and culture and society, and communicate the importance of research to a general audience. What I'll also add is we also saw really significant gains in students' sense of belonging. And that really matters because a lot of research has shown us that one of the greatest predictors of whether or not students will stay in STEM is if they feel that they belong there and if they feel like they can take on that identity of a scientist. And so, we've collected data from students that have backed this up. So I'm going to share just a few quotes from program participants. One program participant said, "I think it should be required core curriculum for all researchers and scientists. The lack of contextualization and consideration of power dynamics within my field make it difficult for me to trust that we can use research for positive transformational change. ADQ trainings, we call asking different questions, trainings, give me tools and a lens that can help me in revisioning, imagining a different way to ask questions and collaborate." And another program participant shared, "I identify as underrepresented in STEM. So a lot of these concepts were not completely new to me. And that's a trend that we do tend to see. The greatest impact to me was that this course created a space where I felt valued and my feelings validated. It gave me more confidence to act on my instincts and desire to change norms in my field. It also helped me to actually imagine and see a future for myself in science where my values can be and are aligned with my research. I also feel like I've gained allies in this endeavor, which gives me greater confidence in my own ability." The types of, in addition to what I've already shared, we've seen participants be ready to take a variety of different types of actions after completing the training. Some students will go on to change the way that they teach courses. We saw someone who teaches microbiology say, okay, I'm going to change the way that I teach the history of microbiology and actually integrate more knowledge from indigenous science and those who have been excluded from its history. We've seen people change the way that they design their research. A researcher in biological sciences shared that they were going to seek out to find or create new data sets because the data set they were currently working with was highly dominated by white males. And the disease that they were studying had actually a greater impact on other populations. We also saw students change the way that their lab functioned so that they could create a more welcoming lab environment for all of those who were entering into that space. So as I said, just some really amazing outcomes from this. So I'll say a little bit more about, to give you a couple more examples of what does this training look like. One of the things we do is we really teach people to think about what does it mean to engage in change-oriented research. Example of that is looking at inequities within our healthcare system. You see here in this picture a Black doctor holding a sign saying systemic racism is a public health crisis, white coats for, it's cut off, but likely Black lives. So, and then you also see a picture of a pregnant woman. And these are both to allude to ongoing inequities within our healthcare system, where we see, for example, Black mothers suffering healthcare issues and mortality rates that are exponentially higher than any other group. And we also see doctors that are beginning to talk about racism, not just as a cultural phenomenon, but as a public health issue. And these are the types of framings that we really, in the program, work to highlight. We work to provide additional scholarly resources and citations that these students can draw upon and pull into their own fields. So research from, say, the history of medicine and the sociocultural study of medicine that then they can pull into their own research. Another area where we've been doing a lot of work is around climate change and the responses of climate scientists to the many ways that we need to adapt to a changing world. And here, what we're seeing is a real need for graduate students and researchers to understand the sociocultural aspects of climate change. One of the things that I often say is that, if science alone could solve this for us, we'd probably be a lot farther along in addressing our climate. But, so therefore we need to be, all scientists need to be thinking about how they can integrate sociocultural factors and, political factors, policy more deeply into their research. And this is what we help them do. We also help them to think about how legacies of inequity are really exacerbated around the impacts of climate change. I have a picture here of the Isle de Saint Jean Charles. And this is a small isle off the coast of Louisiana, and only 277 people live there. And this is an island that is, for all intents and purposes, disappearing right now. And so if we take this from a traditional scientific perspective and we think about application, it would be very easy to say, okay, that's not many people, let's move this community out. But if we look at the historical and cultural factors of this island, then we learn that the residents are Biloxi, Chitimacha, and Choctaw Native Americans who have been living there since 1876, and in fact were relocated to these islands. Now, when we learn that, how does that change how we think about dealing with this, addressing this issue? When we're dealing with a population that has already been relocated once and is now being asked to relocate again. Again, I'm not saying here what the answer is, but I'm saying that these are factors that really need to be a part of the equation. In some cases, quite literally the equation. So what I really strongly believe, and that we really teach within the Asking Difference Questions program, is that equity is the future. If we are not addressing questions of equity while we are finding new solutions to issues such as climate change, health, and new technologies, we're ultimately not going to get nearly as far as we could otherwise. Because we have many people who are already living in toxic landscapes and suffering from environmental injustice. And it is often these communities that are most impacted. In the Central Valley here in California, we have communities that are suffering from extreme heat that are, very low income. I mean, we're talking about average incomes of under $8,000 a year. And and they have poor water quality. They're living in a toxic landscape from air quality issues, pesticides. I could go on and on. And if we're not aware of this, if we're not thinking about this and forefronting this in our research, things are probably going to get worse before they get better. When we turn to healthcare, we may have to ask ourselves, what good are new healthcare innovations when some people can't even access basic care in hospitals? When we turn to technology, we can think about questions such as, for whom are we designing new technologies? I do a lot of work within transportation and mobility justice, and we're spending a lot of time thinking about the shift to electric vehicles and potentially autonomous vehicles. For whom are these changes happening? For whom are these technologies being developed? And how can we integrate communities that have suffered from poor transportation systems into this process to really, at the end, have more collaborative processes? So these are the kinds of things that we work to provide our trainees with tools to really address these sorts of issues, so that they can, at the end of the day, be asking different questions that have more impact and that are contributing to basic research questions in their field. So I'll pause there. I have up here my contact information, along with both the link to the Feminist Research Institute webpage on the Asking Different Questions program that you can access, as well as a YouTube channel. So each of the trainings that we do is about half hour in length, and usually we follow those with a half hour to 45-minute discussion that is facilitated by trained graduate students. But you can, and you can access these trainings on our YouTube channel. So please do feel free to look that up and check them out. And of course, reach out to me. I am happy to answer any questions you have, both now and in the future.
Thank you. And that was really a fascinating and important discussion that you provided. And I have a few questions that I might start out our conversation with, and then I hope that soon people will be adding some questions and comments in the Q&A box. And so I was actually wondering a little bit more about the nuts and bolts of the training program, and what kind of dynamic occurred in the, as you gathered with graduate students and other researchers who want to learn how to ask new questions and approach their disciplines in new ways. And apparently they can watch these previous trainings and kind of benefit from the conversations that have already occurred. I'm wondering whether you actually have an expectation that people come to the workshops prepared to describe their current approaches to their disciplines, and whether you engage directly with these perhaps time-worn approaches that are not yet asking the kinds of trenchant questions that need to be asked in order to achieve more equity, and whether you attempt to engage directly with the approaches that are already being practiced, or if that dynamic doesn't actually occur in the context of the trainings.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, one of the big challenges of this training is that whatever discipline we're working with always wants to hear like specific examples for their field. And that's very understandable. And I work to do that as much as possible. The training is made to be applicable to all fields, but I have done customizations with fields, including medicine and healthcare, economics, and now climate sciences, and as well as, a little bit here and there in others. And what I can say is there's one module that is always really good. The concepts in there are always really crucial. It's called Making More Accurate Knowledge. And it's a module where I talk about, I contrast traditional notions of objectivity with more of a, I guess you could say, perspectival version of objectivity that's emerged from research in feminist science studies. And really, at the end of the day, what that module is teaching and arguing is that objectivity, as we traditionally think about it, is more of an ideal than a reality. And when we account for that, and we are very honest and real about the ways that our training, our life experiences, our perspective impact the research that we're doing, then we ultimately have better research, and people can assess it with more honesty and more clarity. when I teach this, graduate students and faculty, they see it. Sure, we'll have lots of arguments about where it applies more in their field versus others. But on the grand scale, they see how this works. But questions still arise around like, well, but I can't write about this in my publications because it's not acceptable in my field. And that's real. And to me, part of the challenge of that is significant. So I also talk with participants about ways to make change happen and how they can work in community and in collaboration to slowly change norms in their field that they believe need changing, while simultaneously protecting themselves professionally, because as young scholars, that is very real.
Actually, Sarah, this is another one of the questions that I had prepared, which is whether traditional evaluation processes, particularly for graduate students, are sufficiently flexible to enable fair evaluation of what might be considered a non-traditional approach in a particular discipline. And if they're not sufficiently flexible, what should universities do to ensure fair and effective evaluation for these relatively vulnerable researchers?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say that, it really varies. I know there are places that have really flexible systems. I came from a graduate program that did, that enabled me, enabled me to do this kind of work. But obviously that's far from universal. Things that I think universities can do is one, to programs can allow graduate students to have committee members outside of the department and even outside of their field. I think that can be really impactful. And their remaining committee members in the discipline can really make space for the insights that outside committee member and that outside field brings. I think, that's something very tangible. And ultimately, being willing to be a bit more flexible in terms of what defines a discipline. As I'm sure, many in HIBAR can appreciate, disciplines are incredibly important. And when we focus too much on guarding our boundaries, that we often can miss the bigger picture that is specific, particularly around societal needs. But also I'd say, some real insights that can arise in basic research. So I'd say that the most important thing that departments and faculty can do is to find ways to institutionally make space for graduate students. And I would say also another very specific recommendation would be to provide support, including funding for graduate students to invest time and energy into connecting with communities or research partners outside of academia.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you. I'd like to turn now to some of the questions that attendees have been putting in the Q&A box. And here's one question, not quite related to what we've just been talking about, but the question is, did you meet resistance to discussion of the universality of implicit bias?
I would say yes and no. The one thing that I, want to be very clear about is, especially in the first couple years of this program, this was a program that people opted into. And so oftentimes if people were choosing to come, they were already interested to an extent, and many of them actually were seeing problems. They were very aware of the bias and didn't know what to do about it. Now that said, as we have started doing more trainings in more mandated sessions, more resistance is arising. But at the end of the day, I usually don't have to reach very far to find discipline-specific examples of how particularly historic bias continues to exist on the level of the entire field. And I think this is also something that really helps, that the training really helps to make the training more effective, is I don't talk about individual bias. It is not a training about individual implicit bias. It is a training about systemic bias within an entire field. And the way that I teach that is I say, this is inevitable. because the history of science is just like literally, historically, factually, deeply integrated with histories of racism and colonialism, patriarchy. I mean, even the field of eugenics for many fields. And that's just true. And inevitably, some of that history is still going to be woven into our practices. And the more work we do to be aware of that, the more autonomy and responsibility we have to actually change that. So at the end of the day, what I'm really providing is more of a message of hope and responsibility than one of, say, like, guilt or whatnot.
Thank you. A moment ago, Sarah, you mentioned something about mandated sessions, and one of the attendees promptly asked the question, under what circumstances is ADQ being mandated? And related to that, another attendee asked something about whether the sessions build upon each other, which raises the question of whether attendees might attend more than one event in order to continue to develop their ability to ask these new questions.
Yeah. So, I mean, the entire curriculum was designed to be modular so that theoretically each unit can stand alone. That said, when I teach them, there are certain orders that I like to go into because yes, they do build on each other. And so some students will just attend, say, like one of these, and others will do a whole series of up to 10 units in a quarter. Now, when they are quote unquote mandated, this means that, say, their professor has decided that I'm going to come in and teach, essentially teach 2 of their classes. And so they enrolled in this course, not necessarily because they wanted to learn about how to do more equitable research, but they're getting taught that anyway. I also did 2 units in partnership with our Office of Research's Responsible Conduct of Research training, which is required of all researchers, with federal grants, and so that's another place where people have it. They didn't necessarily opt into a whole program. They're just trying to fulfill some requirements that already exist. And this is one of the options of a way that they can fulfill that requirement. So at this point, that's kind of what mandated means. It's not like it is at no level like mandated, say, for an entire graduate program or anything like that. It's essentially like their professors are saying, you're going to do this.
Sarah, that kind of is related to what you had mentioned earlier about this training as a means of validating and empowering beginning researchers so that they feel they belong in the research milieu and feel more motivated to stay with this work. And in addition to the kind of training that you're describing, are there other things that universities can do to retain graduate students or other early career researchers who are motivated to do work that will benefit society?
Well, I mean, one area that I know HIBAR is really attending to and that is really important are the hiring, tenure, and review processes and what sort of scholarship and work is valued in those processes. I think that is huge. So sometimes I will, when I do these trainings, as I mentioned, there's sort of, it starts out with like a half-hour lecture, and then we have these like ideally 45-minute discussions. During the discussion, usually my graduate student facilitators have the conversations with graduate students of up to like 5 to 8 people at a time. I usually facilitate the conversations with any faculty that attend. I can say, almost every single time when it's a conversation among faculty, this issue of tenure and review and what a department values comes up over and over as the biggest barrier to doing this work. And frankly, also their willingness to push their students and support their students in doing this work. It's not that they don't value the research, it's that they're concerned that if they let their students do the kind of work that they really want to, that they're not setting themselves up for success in the academic job market. And it's, and I mean, that's so I'd say that's the area that we really need the greatest interventions on. I mean, beyond that, I'd also say that graduate students at many universities actually are our leaders in pushing forward like more equitable, what it looks like to have a more equitable research culture. They frankly have, I think, more answers than the rest of us, and supporting them in that work, both, by, following through on their recommendations, listening to them, but also ideally in supporting them financially, because they're doing all that work as service work under, great pressures and oftentimes, without a big take-home paycheck. And so if they can be supported in that work financially, I think that's huge. And that frankly is, an equitable practice.
Mhm. Obviously, a single university is not able to produce culture change across the entire landscape of higher education. If other universities are interested in implementing a program like ADQ, what steps would you recommend that they take?
Well, I'd say I'm happy to talk with anyone who's interested. I'd say, first, look at the information that's been shared to really decide, like, is this something that's right for you? If it is, please reach out to me. I am in the process of creating a facilitator guide that will explain sort of like in greater depth the entire process, and have almost sort of like, I call them more facilitator guides, but you could also call it like a lesson plan or whatnot. I would also highly encourage any university that wants to do something like this to partner with faculty within that do work in science and tech, particularly in science and technology studies, but also fields such as ethnic studies, indigenous studies, as well as other humanities, social sciences, because that's where this research is coming from. I can almost guarantee you, most universities will have someone who's who's highly expert in these fields, as expert or more than myself. In fact, you may have someone at your university that I'm consistently citing.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Are you aware of other universities that are actively doing things that are akin to the ADQ program?
UC Santa Cruz has a Science and Justice Research Center that supports research that resonates with this work. I know there's others. Stanford has a Gendered Innovations Center that also does some really interesting work. I'd love, if anyone knows of other sites, I'd love to hear of them. It's something that I'm still, a network that I'd say I'm still working to develop. Because I'm sure I'm not the only one doing something like this out there.
Mm. Well, we're hoping that the posting of the recording of this session will also help to get the word out, and maybe you'll start hearing from an even more diverse range of universities that get wind of this activity. We have a question about whether you've encountered any resistance as the leader of these trainings, and from other faculty members, and whether there's any question about what kinds of people are leading these trainings, like not from the same discipline, and offering these more generalized trainings, or in other ways. Has there been any faculty resistance that you have found among those professors who have actually attended the training?
Within those that have attended the trainings, no. I am very, sort of like I was at the beginning of this presentation, I am very clear about the expertise that I have and that I don't have. And I don't try and claim any expertise, say like I did a whole series in economics here at UC Davis. And I was very clear about my lack of expertise in economics and framed the work we were doing as a co-learning process. Now, that said, in that case, I just spent an entire year working with the economics faculty to ensure that the training was highly relevant to them. And that was fantastic because we were able to integrate in discipline-specific examples into the training that it would have taken me a lot more work to identify and do those on my own. And so to me, I'm not trying to, I try to be very clear and like not overstepping the bounds of my own expertise. And so I think that, I don't know if that's why I haven't heard that much from that. But I have absolutely no problem, being humble and saying, well, I don't know the answer to that, or you probably, know more than I do about that, and working on creating a space of like co-creation of knowledge.
Yeah, that actually is related to this question of the fine tuning of the training in order to kind of match the needs of particular disciplines. And one possible innovation actually would be to co-lead a session with you and faculty members from either a single discipline or multiple disciplines, if you knew that student attendees were coming from different fields. And that could not only maybe lead to a more refined and focused approach, but also give the students confidence that there's an endorsement coming from faculty members in their own fields. So that seems like one possibility. Yeah, so we were, one of the things we were wondering was whether there were any refinements that you found yourself making in order to provide discipline-specific versions of this training.
Yeah, I mean, we've made a lot of refinements. I'll continue using the economics example because that's the one we did this summer. But in that case, this was the first year of the training. The plan is to actually transfer leadership of the training to their faculty. And so in this first year, I taught it by myself. Next year, I will co-teach it with their faculty. And then the goal is the third year, they will teach it and I will be in more of a consultant role. And so I'm very excited to see how that goes, because I mean, that's ultimately, there's only one of me. I mean, there's obviously lots of other people that can do this kind of work, but it is more effective when someone from the discipline can, in the sense that it gives the knowledge a little more legitimacy. I mean, there's reasons to challenge that model, of course. But yeah, that's something that we're trying out. We're looking at similar models within climate sciences in the curriculum creation that we're doing there right now. But we'll see how those go, because obviously climate sciences is highly interdisciplinary. And so we're kind of going from like an interdisciplinary training to an interdisciplinary study.
Well, actually, that progressive trajectory that you just described, where eventually the training would simply become part of the culture of individual departments or disciplines, that's the culture change you're talking about. Not only the upstart beginning researchers who are hoping to reach towards some kind of changes in their own careers, but actually to somehow implant the training within the disciplines, as you say, gives it legitimacy, but it also means that it filters out into the discipline more broadly and more organically. So yeah, that's very interesting. We're wondering as well if you've observed other skills that graduate students might need in order for the Asking Different Questions program to be fully effective. And if so, what kind of training could universities provide, for example, as part of an undergraduate program, to develop these skills before students reach graduate school?
Yeah, that's a great question. I will say one skill that's emerged as really important is the ability to learn through discussion, and the confidence to express their own expertise or opinions within a learning community. We have seen that I have had quite a number of STEM graduate students and even postdocs tell me that this is the first time they ever had anyone ask them what they really think. Not just like what the right answer is. And it's incredibly impactful on them to just be asked what they think. And so it would be great to see that happening more earlier. Let's see, other things at the undergraduate level. It's kind of funny, you put it that way, because I've tried giving this training in the undergraduate setting a few times, and its impact is really variable. And what I've learned is that particularly for first and second year undergraduates, they don't actually have enough literacy in the norms of science to really understand what I'm like, in a sense, like what we're really talking about. They can take the concepts and they kind of extrapolate out to their own other things they know. Like I remember one time, a place where we normally end up talking about, say, like objectivity in science, we ended up talking about sports because that's what they could attach to it. So it plays out, but then again, but a colleague of mine who co-created this project with me, Kalindi Vora, who's now at Yale University, she's taught this to some second, third year, or some third, fourth year undergraduates, and she found it to be very effective with them. So I think it really varies.
Yeah, on the students' ability, as you say, to engage in a kind of open, self-questioning conversation. I mean, it also, what you're saying suggests the importance of an undergraduate curriculum that includes a wide range of exposure to disciplines, including the more humanistic situations of kind of active questioning and, asking deep philosophical questions. Speaking of which, one final question before we turn it over to you for some concluding takeaways, and that has to do with the importance of having a theory of change. And I wonder if you can describe in a little bit more detail how a theory of change can be used to design effective programs that will enable lasting change within cultures, including academic cultures.
It's funny you should ask that, because I am literally right now working on a paper with a graduate and undergraduate student about the theory of change of this program. And so I'm actually going to share this graphic that Tara Posey, the graduate student working on this project, has created. And so what you see here is our theory of change in a nutshell is that we can't focus just on individual behavior change. A lot of the histories of a lot of the ways that people often try and make a behavioral intervention focuses on changing the individual. And we're less focused on changing the individual and more on, changing the system, changing the whole entire culture. And so what you see in this diagram is, we have of course, yes, we're educating the individual with an educational program, but the areas that we want to make an intervention include the social, cultural, and institutional. Within the social, we're talking about changing the sort of like support that they receive from peers, mentors, and collaborators. And this is where faculty are absolutely crucial. I'm going to kind of I might use this question, if you don't mind, as sort of like me dovetailing into the takeaways, because it's actually aligning really well with what I wanted to say. And that is like the one thing I would encourage people to do is to make space for their graduate students to create this social milieu where this sort of research is acceptable. The ways they can do that, the literal practices, as you can see in this diagram, are through community building and communication. So allowing students to create community around doing this type of work, because that is vitally necessary at this point in time, since this type of research is not mainstream. And to communicate to the students that this is acceptable, and encourage them and provide networking and support to do that.
Literally, what do you mean by community building? Actually having students convene in groups and talk about how they're trying to make this effort together? Yes,
absolutely. Say, what that looks like may vary. One really tangible example is if you have a group, is to convene groups of students that are working directly with, say, like community organizations. Because if they can talk together, troubleshoot the challenges they're finding, just get that additional support. I think if anyone's looked at some of the literature coming out around mentoring, you'll see that we want to move, that the advice is to move less from the traditional single mentor model into having multiple mentors. And so in some ways, what this is just an example of that, to create networks of peer mentoring where they can help each other, because if their advisor, in their field haven't done this type of work traditionally, they need to find other communities that can support them. So you could think of this as like a lab group, but specifically for, asking different questions in their field. And then, the other areas we want to see change is around the cultural realm. There, the support looks like recognition and saying that, yes, this is appropriate in the field. And so that does require in practice shifts in how we think about service work. And also, I would say, in a way activist works. One of the things that I teach graduate students in the program is that they can think about research as movement work. Because if we want to be addressing some of the issues around, say, climate change, that does require movement work. And there's lots of expertise from both historical and ongoing activist movements that we learn from in the program. And it can be big stuff, or it can be frankly as simple as strategizing with peers around how to maybe ask a really hard question at a conference, but a question that needs to be asked that may be challenging, say, someone with prestige in the field. How can you do that and simultaneously protect yourself? That's the kind of, very practical things we may talk about. And then at the last sort of, realm where we see change needing to happen is at the institutional level. And frankly, like, this program is already doing that, because this is a course graduate students can take. It's something that is being endorsed, by their faculty. So that's a start, and we just want to continue to see more support for students to have time, funding, and to create policies that can really support students' ability to integrate these kinds of approaches into their teaching and their research.
So you described the program as a course. Are students getting credit for it? Yes,
we offer it once a year. We've been offering it as a 1 to 2 credit course. Going forward, it's going to become a 2 or 4 credit course. At sometimes some students are not experiencing it as that. They may, like I'm doing a workshop on how to create an anti-racist lab for the immunology department. Just a 1 unit, but yes, students do have that option.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm keeping an eye on the clock, and we have about a minute to go. Did you want to add anything else to your takeaways?
I think the last thing I'll add is that I very much welcome dialogue around this. I am looking to create my own sort of community of practice, you could say, around people wanting to do this work and make these sorts of changes in the research that we do. And I welcome, any connections from this.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for sharing this exciting and important program with us. That was an excellent presentation, and really appreciate the questions that came in through the Q&A box. And thanks to all of you who've attended today's webinar. We hope you'll stay tuned for announcements of future events in this series. Thanks again.
Thank you.